I like getting straight to the point, so in this video I'm going to show you step by step how I built this paludarium. To begin, I'd like to mention that I have a list of all the materials I use down in the description below. There are also Amazon links to everything, but you can get a lot of them much cheaper if you just go to your local hardware store. Alright, now that I have that out of the way, let's start with the background. The base of the background is made from this insulation foam board. Start by taking measurements of your tank and then marking them on the foam. I recommend cutting your foam slightly larger than the background of your tank to account for any mistakes. Here I use another sheet of insulation foam as a guide to mark a straight line. This next step is a mess, so I would advise having a vacuum nearby. Using a saw, I cut through the foam and it wasn't perfect by any means, so I just used some sandpaper to smooth up the edges. Now, because I screwed up, I needed to hot glue a smaller piece of foam to the larger piece. Here was the result. Now I'm using some sandpaper to roughen up the surface of the foam. This will give the expanding foam that I will use later in the video a surface it will more readily adhere to. I wanted some wood to poke out of the background like branches, so I ordered some. This is called ghost wood. It is filled with cracks and crevices and just has tons of detail. Fun fact, this piece of wood has more character than my high school history teacher. I arranged it on the foam until I thought it looked just right. This process took me 3 hours, but I like to take my time with these things. I also used some scrap foam to temporarily prop up the pieces. Once happy with it, I carved holes into the foam with a knife and stuck the wood into it. This will make the wood more stable in the long run. Here's a view from the back. On to my favorite part of the build, the spray foam. Using some simple painter's tape, I make a border of sorts around the edges. This prevents the spray foam from spilling off or expanding out of the background. Here I just have some simple spray foam intended for outdoor ponds. It's water resistant and animal safe. A lot of different brands work well, but this is just the one I prefer. These are net pots, which you can buy for a couple cents a piece. I have some smaller ones and some larger ones as seen here. As I spray foam the background, I will stick these into it. I also have some cork bark for texture. With all the materials ready, I begin to foam. All in all, it's a fairly simple process, but there are a couple things you should keep in mind. For starters, the foam will expand far more than you initially expect. I cannot emphasize this enough. Also, if you are planning on using net pots or cork bark, you need to stick them in the foam fairly quickly. The foam loses its tackiness only after a few minutes. Now I begin putting the pots and cork into the foam. Don't think too much about this step and just kind of go for it. I suggest that you use more pots than you think you'll need because it looks more natural when you have a lot of plants growing out of the back. I forgot to mention that all the net pots are stuffed with paper towels. This is to prevent the foam from expanding into the pots and leaving no room for soil. Once I was finished, I let it dry overnight. And this is how it looked the following morning. Alright, now that the foam is pretty much cured, I removed the tape from the sides. For some reason, I always find this step super satisfying. The next step is carving the foam. For this, I'm using a razor scraper and an X-Acto knife. This step is essential for two main reasons. Firstly, you can carve it to your liking and make it look more natural. Secondly, it is vital that you take off all the shiny bits. It'll make more sense later, but silicone doesn't adhere well to the shiny exterior of the foam. When you carve it, you reveal the rough interior, which has more surface area for the silicone to stick to. Now, this step took a while. I go by the ideology that you should carve the foam until it looks like a sponge that decided to take a stroll into a meat grinder. And after a few hours of carving, here was the result. And just like every other part of the build, it made a mess. In order to conceal the foam, I'm going to use silicone and cocoa fiber. The silicone either needs to be free of any mold inhibitors, or to be extra safe, you can just use aquarium silicone. I started by putting almost a metric ton of silicone on the foam. From there, I put cocoa fiber on top and pressed it in. Make sure to press it in well, or else it will wash off over time. And I would like to add that this process needs to be done in a well-ventilated area, or preferably outside. I did it in my garage and it smelled like death for 2 weeks. After about a week of curing, this was the finished product. To remove extra cocoa fiber, I vacuumed up the whole background. Make sure to get in all the nooks and crannies. From here, I was nearly ready to silicone it to the tank. Before I did so though, I sanded the back of it and then vacuumed up the debris. I also cut a notch down the left side of the background. This will allow me to hide the filter's wire behind it. I will go more in depth about this later. It was too difficult to film this step of attaching it to the tank, so I did it off camera. Basically, I pumped out an entire tube of silicone onto the back pane of the glass of the tank. It was probably unnecessary, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Then I put in the background and weighed it down with a couple weights. Here's the filter's wire going down through the background and out the tank. Also, I put a bead of silicone wherever the background met the glass in order to prevent any animals from getting stuck behind it. I covered up the silicone with more cocoa fiber. Even with another week of curing, the background still smelled terrible. I decided to wash it down outside. On the bright side, this not only fixed my smell problem, but it also washed off all the extra cocoa fiber. Using a small piece of tubing, I drained the tank and brought it inside. Okay, now after going through way more work than I anticipated, this was the result. So I wanted to keep the mechanics and hardscape of this tank fairly simple. Starting with a piece of filter foam, I used this as a barrier between the false bottom and pond area. I cut it slightly longer than the length of the tank so I could wedge it in there and not need to use glue. Water can readily pass right through this. In order to hide the filter foam, I use lava rock, which also serves as a growing surface for beneficial bacteria and biofilm. It's super porous, so it has the added benefit of being lighter weight. Here's some super glue that I used in conjunction with cotton balls to glue the rock formation together. Now, stacking the rocks on top of each other was not an easy process by any means. It took me about 2 hours to get it right. Here are some examples where I used cotton and super glue to stick the rocks together. This was the finished hardscape. I'm going to conceal the cotton later on with just some sand. Now, this was a mistake on my end, but the filter foam kept sliding back because I didn't glue it in. So in order to stabilize it, I put some scrap pieces behind it to stop the foam from pushing any farther. The filter I used was nothing special, and I just placed it in the false bottom area. The only reason why I'm using it is for water circulation. After I let the super glue dry overnight, I added the sand. I then filled it up with water so I could get an idea of how everything would look. Because I had water in the tank, I decided to test the filter. I used a piece of lava rock and tubing to adjust the flow. Once I was happy with the way the water flow and everything turned out, I drained the tank. Now, onto the false bottom. The false bottom is where all the extra water from the substrate will drain into. This will stop the dirt from staying waterlogged and soggy. I'm filling it up with LECA. LECA stands for Lightweight Expanded Clay Aggregate. Simply put, it's clay balls. I made sure to wash it several times before adding it into the tank. I filled it up just to the level of filter foam, but I didn't want to go any higher than that. In order to stop the dirt I will use from falling into the false bottom and making the water cloudy, I used a sheet of weed barrier. This will allow water through, but not the dirt. From there, I added a couple lava rocks on top of the barrier to keep it in place. I then added a thin layer of charcoal. This will help filter any water passing through, and it will also serve as a refuge for microfauna. Finally, onto the substrate. I will put in the description what I used to make it, but simply put, it's just my take on an ABG mix. Planting the tank was probably the most time-consuming part for me. I don't have footage of the whole 9 hours of me planting it, but this clip should give you an idea of my workflow. I'll leave a list in the description of the plants I used. If you're interested in a whole video dedicated to me explaining the plants in the tank, please let me know in the comments. I also used this dusk moss mix throughout the tank. I spread it on the background and the branches in hope of it eventually covering everything in a thick layer of moss. I'll make a follow-up video explaining it more in depth. Before I show you the final tank, there are a few things I'd like to mention. I have the tank hooked up to a Mist King misting system. I have it set to mist for 20 seconds, 6 times throughout the day. The water reservoir and pump are kept in the cabinet underneath the tank. In addition to this, I have a small PC fan running at the top of the tank for air circulation. For lighting, I have 2 powerful aquarium LEDs to light up the tank. I'll leave links in the description of the exact ones I used. Now that I have all that boring stuff out of the way, here are some shots of the final build.